In this video we will discuss World War II. Pearl Harbor brought the U.S. kicking and screaming into the war. The U.S. must fight a two-front war against both Germany in Europe and Japan in the Pacific. On the home front, Americans had to put their lives on hold, like they did during World War I, rationing goods, working in weapons factories, and limiting the use of resources. This would be a war that needed all Americans to contribute to defeat two dangerous enemies. Between December 1941 and May 1942, the Empire of Japan successfully conquered the territories of Guam, Hong Kong, Singapore, Java, Borneo, and the Philippines. They intended to expand next into Burma, India, and Australia. U.S. Navy cryptanalysts had begun breaking Japanese communication codes early in 1942, and knew for weeks ahead of time that Japan was planning an attack in the Pacific at a location they called AF. Suspecting it was Midway, the Navy decided to send out a false message from the base claiming it was short of fresh water. Japan's radio operators sent out a similar message about AF soon afterward, confirming the location of the planned attack. After two unsuccessful attempts to defeat the Japanese invasion fleet, a wave of U.S. carrier-launched bombers struck three Japanese carriers and set them ablaze. In response, Japan's surviving carrier launched two waves of attacks on the USS Yorktown, which had to be abandoned but remained afloat. U.S. dive bombers from all three carriers returned the attack on the remaining Japanese carrier and set it ablaze as well, putting all four Japanese carriers out of commission. As a result of the U.S. victory in the Battle of Midway, Japan abandoned its plan to expand its reach in the Pacific and would remain on the defensive for the remainder of World War II. The battle injected U.S. forces with confidence and drained Japanese morale, turning the tide of war in the Pacific strongly in favor of the Allies. Following the Japanese attacks of December 7, 1941, the Japanese military made substantial gains in the Pacific. Their goal was to neutralize the U.S. fleet, seize territories rich in natural resources, and obtain military bases throughout the Pacific to defend their growing empire. In 1942, Admiral Chester Nimitz made commander of the Central and South Pacific areas. To push back against Japanese advances, Admiral Nimitz, with the benefits of code breaking and opportunity, used the strategy known as island hopping. Essentially, they played leapfrog with the Japanese, landing their forces in areas where they could disrupt enemy supply lines and isolate thousands of Japanese. By establishing forward air bases, they extended their ability to attack deep into enemy territory and helped lay the groundwork for their next hop. The Battle of Stalingrad was a brutal military campaign between Soviet and German forces. It was one of the largest, longest, and bloodiest engagements in modern warfare. Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union stalled at Leningrad and Moscow because of the bitter cold winter. Hitler changed tactics and tried to take the Soviet oil fields at Stalingrad. The Germans almost won until the winter set in. Many German troops froze or starved to death. From August 1942 through February 1943, more than 2 million troops fought in close quarters, and nearly 2 million people were killed or injured in the fighting, including tens of thousands of Russian civilians. The victory for the Soviets marked a turning point in the war on the Eastern Front. The Soviets were able to advance towards Germany. Operation Torch was the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied French North Africa between 1942 and 43. American General Dwight D. Eisenhower planned an attack of three key areas to liberate the region from Nazi control. The purpose of the operation was not only to defeat the Germans, but to allow for the Americans to engage the Nazis on a limited scale. The Allies were aided by the fact that the Axis was not focused on this region, so it was not as heavily defended. The Germans were focused on Stalingrad on the Eastern Front. The Americans used this operation as combat experience for its newly drafted infantry. They just weren't ready to fight the Germans in Europe. The Allies were able to drive out the Nazis and establish a foothold in northern Africa. Operation Avalanche was the Allied invasion of Italy from the Mediterranean Sea. It took place in 1943 by the U.S. and British forces. The first stage was the invasion and conquering of the island of Sicily, followed by a mainland invasion. After defeating the Axis powers in North Africa, the Allies set their sight on what they called the soft underbelly of Europe, the Italian peninsula. Allied leaders knew that the Italians were not as formidable as the Germans, so they planned an invasion to liberate the country from the fascists. The Allies made their way north and liberated town after town until they reached the Alps. Next up, Nazi-occupied France. To prevent the high inflation that happened during World War I, the government set up the OPA. It froze prices on most goods. Congress also raised taxes. WPB decided which companies would make war materials and how they were distributed. The Office of Price Administration set up a system of rationing. They issued coupons to buy scarce items. Households would receive ration books with coupons to be used for buying such scarce goods as meat, shoes, sugar, coffee, and gasoline. This was a way that everyone could contribute to the war effort. Once again, the government took control of the economy to create weapons for war. The War Productions Board was brought back to convert companies from peacetime to wartime production. It also allocated raw materials to key industries. By February 1942, the last automobile was produced for private use. Automobile factories produced planes and tanks. By 1943, shipyards were producing 140 Liberty ships per month. By 1944, nearly 18 million people were working 24/7, 3 times as many as in 1941. 6 million women worked in war factories while being paid 60% of what men were paid. Over 2 million minorities also contributed to the war effort. During World War II, technology to prevent attack was just as important as technology to damage your enemy. American and British physicists made rapid advances in the improvement of radar and sonar. Centimetric radar used narrow beams of short wavelength, which improved the quality and accuracy of radar used against the Nazis. This new type of radar was made smaller and installed on airplanes and submarines to detect the enemy. The Allies also used radar and sonar to detect German naval mines, radar to locate them, and sonar, which sent out sound waves to detect the mines, to detonate mines that exploded when near a ship. African Americans served their country well in World War I and once again stepped up to serve their country in World War II. Before Pearl Harbor, A. Philip Randolph, a prominent African American labor leader, began to push for the integration of companies with defense contracts. To achieve this, he planned a march on Washington and promised over 100,000 demonstrators. FDR, fearing violence and political backlash, established the Fair Employment Practices Commission to investigate discrimination in war industries. Executive Order 8802 banned discrimination of workers in defense industries or the government based on race. At first, many industries resisted integration, but FDR strengthened the FEPC 2 years later to ensure strict enforcement of Executive Order 8802. By the end of the war, African Americans held 8% of the jobs in the defense industry, up from 3% in 1941. The FEPC was not renewed in 1946 and lost its funding. The Great Migration that occurred during World War I improved conditions for many African Americans, but led to racial tensions in northern cities. In 1942, James Farmer established the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, to challenge the system of segregation and discrimination during World War II. Farmer created CORE as a nonviolent approach to combating racial prejudice. He began by using sit-ins to protest public segregation in Chicago. CORE also targeted segregation in theaters and restaurants, winning a major victory by forcing a Washington, D.C. restaurant to serve African Americans. After World War II, CORE would shift its focus to the South. First Lieutenant Vernon Baker was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions in Italy, when he and his platoon killed 26 enemy soldiers and destroyed 6 machine gun nests, 2 observer posts, and 4 dugouts. He killed 9 Germans in a pre-dawn battle at an enemy stronghold. With 2/3 of his company wounded or dead, and no reinforcements in sight, Baker's commander ordered a withdrawal. Breaking into tears, Baker protested, "Captain, we can't withdraw. We must stay here and fight it out." Baker also earned a Distinguished Service Cross, only one of 9 African Americans honored by this in World War II. Young African Americans who aspired to become pilots met with significant obstacles, starting with the widespread racist belief that black people could not learn to fly or operate sophisticated aircraft. President Roosevelt expanded the civilian pilot training program in the U.S. in 1938. The Tuskegee Airmen were the first black military aviators in the U.S. Army Air Corps, a precursor of the U.S. Air Force. Trained at the Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama, they flew more than 15,000 individual sorties in Europe and North Africa during World War II. They had destroyed or damaged 36 German planes in the air and 237 on the ground, as well as nearly 1,000 rail cars and transport vehicles, and a German destroyer. In all, 66 Tuskegee-trained aviators were killed in action during World War II, while another 32 were captured as POWs after being shot down. Their impressive performance earned them more than 150 Distinguished Flying Crosses and helped encourage the eventual integration of the U.S. Armed Forces. Before U.S. entry into World War II, the U.S. military developed a specific policy to recruit and train American Indian speakers to become code talkers. A code talker is the name given to American Indians who use their tribal language to send secret communications on the battlefield. The U.S. Army was the first branch of the military that began recruiting code talkers from places like Oklahoma in 1940. Other branches, such as the U.S. Marines and Navy, followed a few years later, and the first class of 29 Navajo code talker U.S. Marine recruits completed its training in 1942. Apart from basic training, these men had to develop and memorize a unique military code using their mostly unwritten language. The first type of code they created, Type 1 code, consisted of 26 Navajo terms that stood for individual English letters that could be used to spell out a word. For instance, the Navajo word for ant, wolachi, was used to represent the letter A in English. Type 2 code contained words that could be directly translated from English into Navajo, and the code talkers also developed a dictionary of 211 terms for military words and names that didn't originally exist in the Navajo language. For example, since there was no existing Navajo word for submarine, the code talkers agreed to use the term beshlo, which translates to iron fish. Most code talkers were assigned in pairs to a military unit. During battle, one person would operate the portable radio, while the second person would relay and receive messages in the native language and translate them into English. Their work was highly dangerous, especially in the Pacific, because Japanese soldiers would deliberately target officers, medics, and radio men, and code talkers had to keep moving as they transmitted their messages. The work of hundreds of code talkers was essential to Allied victory in World War II, and they were present at many important battles, including Utah Beach during D-Day in France and at Iwo Jima in the Pacific. In fact, 5th Marine Division Signal Officer Major Howard Connor stated, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would have never taken Iwo Jima." Mexican Americans strongly identified as Americans and therefore participated strongly in World War II. An estimated 500,000 Mexican Americans served in the armed forces during World War II. The mobilization effort also required widespread participation from non-combatants. Numerous Latino women joined the Women's Army Corps. Thousands of men and women found jobs in defense industries, an opportunity that was almost denied to them. Despite the executive order banning discrimination in war industries, many employers were reluctant to hire Latino workers. Despite more opportunities, racism against Mexican Americans unfortunately was quite common during the war. Zoot suits, or loose-fitting suits with baggy pants, long jackets, and padded shoulders, became very popular among men in minority communities, especially Mexican Americans in California. They were typically worn with hats and long chains. Latino youths wearing zoot suits were seen by affluent whites as street thugs, gang members, and criminals. With the wartime rations of World War II, many Americans saw the wearing of these oversized suits as an unpatriotic waste of resources. In the summer of 1943, tensions ran high between zoot suiters and a large group of sailors, soldiers, and Marines stationed near Los Angeles. Many servicemen saw the zoot suiters as unpatriotic draft dodgers, although many were too young to serve. On May 31st, a clash between uniformed servicemen and Mexican-American youths resulted in the beating of a U.S. sailor. In retaliation, 50 sailors marched through downtown Los Angeles, attacking anyone wearing a zoot suit. In the days that followed, there were multiple riots involving servicemen, police officers, and civilians beating anyone wearing the zoot suits. Rosie the Riveter was the star of a campaign aimed at recruiting female workers for defense industries during World War II, and she became perhaps the most iconic image of working women. American women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers during the war, as widespread male enlistment left gaping holes in the industrial labor force. Between 1940 and 1945, the female percentage of the U.S. workforce increased from 27% to nearly 37%, and by 1945, nearly 1 out of every 4 married women worked outside the home. More than 310,000 women worked in the U.S. aircraft industry in 1943, making up 65% of the industry's total workforce. In addition to factory work and other homefront jobs, some 350,000 women joined the armed services, serving at home and abroad. At the urging of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt and women's groups, and impressed by the British use of women in service, General George C. Marshall supported the idea of introducing a women's service branch into the Army. In May 1942, Congress instituted the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, later upgraded to the Women's Army Corps, which had full military status. Its members, known as WWIIs, worked in more than 200 non-combatant jobs stateside and in every theater of the war. By 1945, there were more than 100,000 WWIIs and 6,000 female officers. In the Navy, members of the Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, or WAVES, held the same status as naval reservists and provided support stateside. The Coast Guard and Marine Corps soon followed suit, though in smaller numbers.